Welcome to the Just Ride Snowboard channel. I'm Lars Horstman, and today I want to share a story with you from one of the people that have approached me to analyze their riding footage. The guy's name is Scott, and he gave me permission to talk about him here. And this whole story is about the big question: what is the right waist width for carving? Big disappointment right away. I cannot answer this question because there's only your right waist width for carving. There's so many factors that determine what could be a good waist width for you and your carving that I actually had to write down a little cheat sheet so I don't forget any of them. So it starts with the obvious thing, that is your boot size, right? Now, the boot size is a tough one because maybe you're actually in the wrong boot size. So therefore, I would very much recommend watch the video that is popping up here on the card about finding the right boot size. Once you're certain that you are in the correct boot size, the next thing is obviously your binding angles. If you ride flatter angles, you will need a wider board than if you ride very steep angles. So that's another subjective thing. Then it depends on your stance width, because obviously a snowboard gets wider as you move from the center towards the tips. So anybody who rides a very wide stance has much more board width right under the feet. This brings us to the subject of waist width. Most manufacturers only give you the waist width and not the underfoot width. And technically the waist width is somewhat irrelevant, because depending on the side cut depth of your board, your underfoot width can be relatively big compared to the actual waist width, or relatively small. So a board with a fairly shallow side cut and a large turning radius only grows that much from the center to where your binding is mounted in width. So on a board like that, you get a different underfoot width than on a board with the same waist width, but with a tighter, deeper side cut. The next thing is terrain choice. So even if you wanted to become the king of riding the steepest groomers in the world, if you never have them where you go to ride, where you spend your holidays or where you live, then there's not really any point in setting yourself up with the gear that would help you to do that. So bear in mind, what's the task? What tool do you need for your job? Some people might not quite understand what I mean when I'm talking about a connection between waist width and terrain choice. So the easiest example for this is the guy that everybody knows in carving world, that is Ryan Neptune. So Ryan rides predominantly on fairly open and very mellow kind of groomers. At his ability level, where he can tilt the board over literally 90 degrees, if he was on a board, let's say with an 8-meter turning radius, at the point that he goes to in regards to board angulation, this board would potentially perform like a 3.5–4 meter radius. Now you can imagine that a turn that tight in pretty flat terrain, he would simply fall on his face. There wouldn't be any momentum anymore. And he needs the momentum to execute all his tricks and spins, right? He needs that speed. Now, the only way to get that dialed for him is to get a board made that has a very large turning radius. So let's say Ryan rides a board, the last thing I've heard is 18 meters. I've also heard rumors of 20. Now an 18-meter radius board for him at his ability level would get him probably half of that in turn radius. Like he'd probably be able to do a 9 or 10-meter turn. Now in flat terrain, that's a radius where you're still carrying enough speed to then actually get some air out of your turns. So you see, there's very much a connection between turning radius of a board and terrain choice, or the terrain that is available. And then next step is, okay, well, how good am I actually? Do I crank the board that high on edge? And if that is the case and you are literally at that level, then yes, you do want something where you have absolutely zero toe or heel drag, and that would put you on a board with a very wide waist width. In regards to the snow conditions you're riding, what I've heard a lot is you want a wider board if you're riding soft snow because you're digging deeper into it. Now, I have a very different take on that, to be honest, and you can see that in Scott's video here actually, when you look at the line he's leaving behind himself. He's on fairly soft snow, and what I am experiencing is in soft snow, if I get my boot to touch the snow, the boot will quite gently dig its own trench without lifting me off the edge, without reducing edge grip. Yes, it is dragging a little bit and you may be able to measure loss in speed or whatever, but there's no real loss in performance in regards to edge grip when you're in soft snow and the tip of your boot brushes through the snow and creates its own little track. There's absolutely no problem with it. The problem comes in when you're on really hard snow. Now, the point on hard snow where your boot touches the snow is obviously later because your board doesn't sink into the snow that much. But when you get to the point, because the snow is firm and unforgiving, the tips of your boot, or heels however, will simply lift your edge off the snow and you're instantly and suddenly on your face. So my take is don't worry too much about soft snow conditions. If you're riding ice and you're, or let's say really firm groomers most of the time, and you're at a level where you tilt your board high on edge, maybe that is also a point where you would want to opt for a slightly wider option. But don't worry about soft snow. I've already mentioned the one last thing that is missing on my list here, and that is the big elephant in the room, and that is ability level. Most people who approach me with this question of what's a good waist width for carving don't actually know. They literally just have not enough experience to determine what they should do, and they are also thinking, oh, it's carving, it's a different aspect of snowboarding, I surely need different gear for this. And the ones of you that are already carving, well, you've certainly experienced boot out, and if not, you're likely on a good waist width. But finding that line where you're comfortable or where you're maybe just not comfortable enough and you need to step it up by a centimeter in waist, that is something that you will figure out as you go. And I don't think it is a good idea if you are the beginner carver to set yourself up with a waist width that is literally the widest you may ever need in your journey. You know, you could take an analogy like if a child that has never ridden a bike sees some downhill mountain bike action and gets obsessed with it and is like, wow, Dad, this is so sick. And Dad says, well, if that's where you want to go, we got to get you a full suspension bike. It doesn't need full suspension for the child to actually learn to ride the bike. And what I'm trying to say with that is I've seen people carve beautiful turns in mellow terrain, doing technically everything correctly with 2 centimeters or an inch, like 2.5 centimeters of overhang on each side. So there's no booting out, they're doing clean turns. They simply haven't approached that level yet where they tilt the board that high on edge that they actually need to get a wider board. And this at that stage is not a matter of, well, they can't get there because then they would boot out. It is a matter of them not being confident enough to actually tip it over. Because guess what? If they did, they would boot out and then they would know that they need a wider board. So here's my story that I had with Scott today, the guy that I mentioned earlier in this episode. Scott is definitely an intermediate rider. He goes pretty fast, he's not scared, he's been snowboarding for a long time. He used to ride duck stands, he's dabbling with double posse right now, and he got inspired by Ryan Napton to improve his carving. So he wanted to be safe, rather safe than sorry, and ordered himself a Napton Twin from Donick in a 28.5 centimeter waist for his size 9 boot. Now, after a while of riding, he realized that the board is quite hard on his ankles, as in it's somewhat difficult to get it on edge because yes, 28.5 waist for a size 9 boot and a rider who is not already an expert is quite hard on the ankles. It requires a lot of force or really good technique to ride a board like this comfortably. Now, here's the thing that made me do this episode today. He emailed me, because you see in the riding footage that I'm showing you here, that he's actually not on a Napton Twin, he's on a Karua. And this is a Cafe Racer, and he said that 260 millimeter waist. And you can see that he's laying out his toe turns quite well, as in, yes, there are lots of little things that he needs to improve, but just look at the edge angle. He does tip this board over quite a bit. And he said to me in his email, you know what, I might just get rid of the Napton Twin. I think I bought it too wide. I'm realizing that on the 260 millimeter waist of the Karua, I'm also not booting out. So this brings me to my main message. It is about ability level. It is about terrain choice. When you see where Scott is riding and you see how well he can actually get the board on edge in his toe turns, and he for himself decides, well, you know what, this is what I do. This is where I ride. I'm not gonna try to push it. I'm not gonna try to carve double black groomers and try to get my armpit into the snow. I'm quite happy here. Then for Scott, the 260 millimeter waist is perfect. He can actually ride that board all over the mountain. It's not a true dedicated carving only type waist width. But he can carve, like, I mean, you know, how much further can he go, right? Like, if he does improve, well, maybe he needs a 270 waist, but does he need a 290? Is he ever going to need a 300? I don't think so. So this idea of waist width it's a bit of a process, and the one and only formula that I can give you, you can get that out of my video on functional waist width, and add a little bit to it maybe. The one formula that I can give you, when you have a board and you have mounted your bindings and you put your boot into the binding and you followed Lars's measurement to center your boot, that's another episode. Centering your boot, super important. You want to be centered across the board. You've done all of this. You're in the right boot size. You set up your bindings at your angles and stance width. And then you measure toe and heel drag. The maximum, if you are like, you know, you're going for your dedicated carver, but you are ways away from being an expert, I want to say you can enjoy a very long journey until you get to this expert stage with about a 1/2 inch of overhang on each side. If you want to be on the safe side, make it 1 centimeter instead of 12.5 millimeters. That's your 1/2 inch there. Make it 10. So 10 millimeter overhang on each side. I want to say, and this is also from personal experience, you will have a very long pathway until you hit the limit of such a waist width. And that board will be much, much gentler on your ankles if you ever encounter something that isn't a perfect groomer. So the big takeaway here is that an appropriate waist width for carving is always relative to all these little things that are pointed out here. Bear in mind that if you get yourself into a board that has a relatively wide waist, things become a little sluggish edge to edge, and the board becomes less and less all mountain friendly as you go up in waist. And what I mean with relatively wide, this is a little bit of a guess, and it's also subjective to ankle strength and ability level, but I want to say if you have less than 15 millimeters, 1.5 centimeters overhang on each side, that's kind of the line under which things start to become more and more cumbersome to get the board on edge, and where the board starts to develop more leverage over your foot than your foot has over the board. So really, you only want to get yourself into this territory of zero boot overhang on each side with a really wide waist width if you are ready to make that board your dedicated carving board, and if you think you've reached a level where you become an expert carver and your terrain requires to tip that board super high on edge to really tighten your turns. That would be steep groomers. In that case, yes, sure, go ahead, get a board that is that wide. Otherwise, you may end up like Scott in our example here, who prepares himself for this scenario but ends up actually not liking the board and finding it quite difficult to ride and quite difficult to improve on. I personally have yet to approach this point where I would want a board that leaves me with absolutely zero toe and heel overhang. All right, bottom line for today, my humble opinion on this whole thing is, first of all, don't overthink it. If you already have a snowboard and you want to learn carving, well, take that snowboard, go carving. You will find out pretty quickly if it's too narrow. And at that point, if it is too narrow, you're booting out, you cannot even get to any kind of improvements. Watch my video on functional waist width and maybe start with that functional waist width. That should get you to a pretty high level of carving before you then hit the wall and need another new snowboard. This, for some of you, might actually be 5 years down the road, because you might only be riding 10 days per year. And the improvement, if you don't ride, like 4 times a week, the steps are pretty small and pretty slow. That's the unfortunate truth. So bear in mind, how often do you ride? Where do you ride? What's your actual ability level? Do you need to force yourself onto the widest possible snowboard? Or can you maybe approach that expert level in smaller steps and work your way up there and truly find out what you need for the way you want to carve? All right, I'm going to close this episode with showing you what board is on the table. People are going to ask, I know it. This is the new Stranda Cheater. That is my choice for a carving board, 1.70 meters. A new cheater literally just means new top sheet. There's nothing new on this thing. Stranda just decided, after years and years of running the green bamboo top sheet, to do a bit of a different print. Same story, still bamboo, still clear coat lacquer on top of it. Beautiful board, looks like a surfboard, I love it. That's what I ride in the wide version. Also my stats, again, for the people that don't know this yet. On my cheater, I have a 275 millimeter waist with a Ride Insano boot in a size 10. My angles are 30 and +9, sometimes +12. I do not boot out unless I go completely crazy, which I do 1% of the time. So, for 99%, the 275 are plenty for Lars. I can actually go a little bit narrower. So there you have it. Hope that helped. Hope you're not freaking out about having the right waist width for tomorrow when you go carving. So, main thing is you have fun out there, and you will slowly and surely find out where you need to be to have the most fun. All right, take care. See you out there. Bye-bye.